I still remember the very first time I sensed a shift in her behavior. It was a mundane Thursday evening, and I had gotten home from work earlier than usual. I let myself in quietly, expecting the customary smell of dinner or the sounds of her moving around the kitchen, but the house was strangely silent. I found Olivia in the living room, sitting on the couch, phone in hand, her posture tense. When she noticed me standing in the doorway, she startled as though I had burst in unannounced. Her cheeks flushed, and she tried to hide the phone screen by angling it against her leg. My eyebrows rose, but she shot me a brittle smile and asked something about my day, voice carrying a forced brightness. It was enough to make my stomach twist with a subtle discomfort. Nothing I could pinpoint exactly, just that peculiar flash of guilt in her eyes when she realized I was watching her. We had been together for nearly 5 years, with one of them spent living in the little bungalow we rented near the park. We were not married, but we were serious enough that I had been considering a proposal. She was creative and spontaneous, the kind of person who would turn ordinary moments into small adventures. When we first met, her laughter was like a magnet drawing me in. It never occurred to me then that she might one day hide secrets. But after that Thursday, I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. Everyone is entitled to private messages, and maybe she was planning a surprise for me. I felt foolish for suspecting her. Still, the uneasy prickle would not go away. Over the next couple of weeks, her phone was suddenly glued to her. She would carry it from room to room, keeping it face down on any tabletop. When a message arrived, she'd check it quickly, eyes darting toward me, then she'd lock the screen almost instantly. I asked if everything was okay, but she would wave it off with a laugh, insisting she had a few new projects at work that required constant communication. The excuse was plausible. Olivia was a freelance graphic designer with a growing list of clients, so I had no reason to doubt her initially. But her behavior was undeniably different, like the way she excused herself to take phone calls upstairs, or how she tensed at certain ringtones. Eventually, I spotted her name saved in 2 different ways on the same phone, one as my contact name, since we often swapped phones for photos or quick tasks, and one as a hidden contact. That was a day I'll never forget, for it confirmed my growing suspicions. She was keeping parts of her digital life separate. I told myself to have a rational conversation with her before jumping to accusations. One evening, as we sat eating takeout, I tried to broach the topic gently, saying something like, "You've been under a lot of stress. Is there anything going on that I can help with?" She smiled a bit too brightly, telling me not to worry, that she was just juggling new clients. Her eyes flickered down to her pad thai, avoiding direct contact. I recall being overwhelmed by a strange mixture of relief and dread. Relief because maybe that was it, just job stress. Dread because I couldn't fully believe her. Where was the warmth in her gaze, the open laughter we used to share? I sensed a widening gulf between us, a quiet wedge of secrets she refused to reveal. One late afternoon, I noticed a small flurry of texts pop up on her lock screen while her phone was briefly unattended on the kitchen counter. She was outside taking a work call, so I couldn't resist glancing at the screen as I passed by. The messages came from an unsaved number, and they read things like, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow," and, "Please, be careful, I miss you." My hand trembled as I struggled not to pick up her phone and scroll. It felt wrong to invade her privacy, yet the texts themselves felt like a betrayal that I couldn't ignore. When she returned inside, she saw me standing there, and I must have looked pale because she immediately asked if I was all right. I mumbled something about feeling dizzy, then excused myself to the bedroom, heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. She did not follow me. Later that night, I found myself lying awake, replaying the sequence of events in my mind. If I confronted her now, would she deny it? Would she twist the narrative, tell me I was jealous and irrational, or that I had misread everything? My heart ached at the possibility. Instead of sleeping, I stared at the faint shadows cast by the moon through the blinds, hearing her quiet breathing beside me, wondering what kind of double life she might be leading and how I had missed the signs for so long. My mind was awash in scenarios. Maybe it was a former flame, or someone she met through a friend, or even a random client who had turned personal. The possibilities tormented me. Over time, I noticed more details that fueled my suspicions. She started dressing differently, wearing new perfumes and outfits I had never seen before, especially on days she claimed she was just heading out to pick up groceries. She often came home later than expected, apologizing with flimsy reasons like, "The line at the store was insane," or, "I ran into an old friend and we caught up." Her stories never quite added up. On a few occasions, I offered to accompany her on these quick errands, only for her to wave me off with a forced grin, saying she needed a little alone time. Between the phone habits, her abrupt changes in personal style, and the inconsistent excuses, I knew something was definitely happening behind the scenes. Eventually, I decided I needed concrete proof. The weight of doubt was suffocating me, affecting my work, my appetite, and my ability to function normally. I was no longer content to just suspect, I had to know for certain. I confided in my friend Marcus, who listened intently and told me I deserved clarity. He suggested I either confront her directly or gather evidence so that there would be no room for her to lie. That nudge from him confirmed what I was already telling myself late at night. I ended up purchasing a small GPS tracker that slipped easily into a car. It felt like something out of a spy movie, an act of desperation I never imagined I'd commit, but my life had turned into a slow-motion disaster. One weekday morning, while Olivia showered, I crept outside and placed the device in the trunk of her car, hidden in a corner among some spare blankets she kept there. My heart hammered the entire time, fear and guilt colliding in my chest. But I kept telling myself that I had a right to the truth. Whatever she was hiding, I needed to see it with my own eyes. The next few days, I monitored the GPS data on my phone. Mostly, I watched it from my office, glancing every so often when I knew she was out. Often, it showed normal paths, local supermarkets, a friend's house I recognized, or the mall. But on Wednesday afternoon, she texted me that she was at a networking event across town. The GPS, however, placed her car near a quiet residential area on the opposite side of the city. My palms grew sweaty just seeing the dot on the map. She was there for 2 hours before heading back. That evening, she came home with a polished story about how she had made connections with potential collaborators at some trendy co-working space. I smiled and nodded, feigning interest, while my chest burned with anger and disappointment. Her lies became more elaborate with each passing day. She'd mention events that never made it onto her social media, or claim that a certain friend was with her when I knew for a fact that friend was out of town. In my mind, the puzzle pieces pointed to one conclusion: Olivia was seeing someone else, carefully orchestrating a separate life. It made my stomach churn to consider how long she'd been doing this and whether it started with an innocent friendship or if it had always been something more. The nights I lay awake grew more frequent, my anxiety building to an almost unbearable level. It felt like living in a house made of glass, watching it crack from every angle while trying to hold it together for just a bit longer. Finally, on a weekend when she claimed to be going to a daytime retreat with a new client, I watched the GPS lead me to a location in the suburbs near a small cluster of townhouses. My heart thundered in my chest. I recognized the street name, a friend of mine once lived there. Telling myself I would only look from a distance, I got in my car and followed the directions, driving with sweaty palms and an elevated heart rate. The sky was overcast, and there was a slight drizzle, which somehow matched the somber dread in my chest. When I arrived, I parked at the far end of the street, making sure no one would spot my car. Then I walked carefully, hood up, glancing around like a criminal as I approached the townhouse address I had gleaned from the GPS. Her car was parked in the driveway. My breathing turned shallow as I surveyed the neighborhood. No sign of her on the front porch, so I assumed she was inside. I stood across the street, battling the urge to storm over and knock on the door. Everything in me wanted to catch them in the act. But I was also terrified of what I might see. My desperation for truth clashed with my fear of heartbreak, tangling my thoughts into a knot. After 5 minutes of silent agony, I decided I had to see for myself. I crossed the street slowly, my steps feeling heavier than they ever had in my life. Heart pounding, I crept around the side of the townhouse, hoping to find an open window or some vantage point that would confirm my suspicions without me needing to barge in. To my astonishment, one of the windows to what looked like a living room was slightly cracked open, the curtain parted just enough to offer a glimpse inside. The angle wasn't perfect, and I had to step into a small garden patch, pressing myself against the siding. Through that narrow gap, I saw a man I did not recognize, tall with dark hair, dressed casually. He was standing close to Olivia, who faced him, her arms around his waist. The two of them were locked in a tender embrace, their foreheads touching, a smile playing on her lips. My stomach twisted into knots. Time seemed to slow as the ache in my chest exploded into raw pain. In that moment, I had the sickening certainty that everything I feared was true. She was with him, her body language comfortable, intimate, and it was obvious this was no casual business meeting. I felt adrenaline surge, tears stinging my eyes. Then, suddenly, she glanced up, as if sensing something. I ducked, my heart lurching, worried she might see me. My breath shuddered. I could barely hold back the wave of despair coursing through me. There it was, right in front of me, the proof. She was having an affair. She had lied to my face, let me believe in a future, all while sharing herself with someone else. A hot flush of anger seared through me. My fingers curled into fists. Part of me wanted to march in there and demand answers, but I was also half paralyzed with shock. An eternity passed, or maybe just a few seconds. When I finally mustered the will to move, I forced myself away from the window, stumbling back to the sidewalk, tears threatening to spill over. I drove home in a daze, hardly remembering the route. My mind spun with possibilities. Should I confront her that night? Should I pack my things and leave? Or should I wait to confront her while she was in the middle of it, ensuring she had no room to squirm out of the truth? My hands shook on the steering wheel. When I got home, I paced the living room like a caged tiger, replaying that image of them embracing over and over in my mind. I wanted to scream, punch something, drink until I forgot. Instead, I called Marcus, my voice trembling as I told him I had my confirmation. He said he was sorry and that I should do what felt right. But at that moment, I had no clue what right even looked like. Olivia came back late that evening, wearing a placid smile, claiming the retreat had been invigorating and that she was exhausted. I tried not to stare at her too obviously, but I felt like I was looking at a stranger. Every loving word she'd once spoken to me now felt hollow. She leaned in for a quick peck on the cheek, and the scent of some unfamiliar cologne lingered on her jacket. My stomach roiled. I pulled back, forcing a weak smile, hoping she wouldn't notice the turmoil in my eyes. She retreated into the bathroom, humming softly, as though nothing was amiss. I stood there in the hallway, my fists clenched, realizing how thoroughly she believed I would never find out. The next day, she left the house in the morning, telling me she was going to run a few errands and meet a client for lunch. I recalled from the GPS that she had spent most Sundays at that same townhouse address. Adrenaline spiked in me, and I resolved that this time, I'd make sure there was no escaping the truth. No more lurking at windows. I wanted to catch her red-handed, confront her with her betrayal in real time. So I grabbed my keys and left a few minutes after she did, making sure to keep enough distance between our cars. Sure enough, the GPS data led me to the same quiet suburban street. I spotted her car in the driveway again. The curtains in the townhouse were drawn, no easy vantage points like before. I parked discreetly near the corner, my heart pounding so loudly it felt like a drum in my ears. For a few minutes, I hesitated, wondering if I should call the police or something absurd, but of course, I had no cause for that. This was my personal nightmare to handle. I gathered my courage, marched up to the front door, and knocked loudly. There was a long moment of silence. My knuckles felt numb from how hard I'd rapped on the door. Finally, footsteps approached. The door opened a crack, revealing the man I had seen through the window. He looked perplexed, maybe even frightened by my intensity. Before he could say a word, Olivia appeared behind him, and her eyes went wide as she recognized me. In that split second, she flushed deep crimson, and a cascade of emotions flickered across her face: shock, guilt, terror. She tried to step forward, sputtering, "What are you doing here?" but I didn't let her lead the narrative. I locked eyes with her, my voice trembling with hurt and anger. "I think the better question is, what are you doing here?" My gaze shifted to the man, who was clearly uncomfortable. He stepped back, allowing me inside, perhaps fearing a scene on his front porch. The living room was modest, with a couch, a small TV, and a clutter of personal items that unmistakably indicated Olivia spent a lot of time there. My stomach churned at the sight of her scarf draped over a chair, her favorite mug on the table. This wasn't a one-time fling, but a second life she had been leading. She shut the door behind me, panic evident in her voice as she pleaded, "This isn't what it looks like." I barked a humorless laugh, bitterness searing my throat. "So it's not you sneaking around with another man, lying to me for weeks?" She pressed her palms together, stumbling over her words, trying to construct some half-baked explanation. The man, whose name I still didn't know, stepped forward cautiously and tried to intervene, his tone shaky. "Look, let's just calm down and talk." I shot him a glare. "Stay out of this," I snapped. "I'm talking to her." Olivia started crying, tears rolling down her cheeks, but my empathy was buried beneath the avalanche of betrayal I felt. She mumbled phrases like, "I didn't mean for it to go this far," and, "I was going to tell you," but they sounded hollow. I could only stare at her, fury mixing with heartbreak. The reality that she had carried on an entire relationship behind my back was suffocating. It occurred to me that I didn't even know how long it had been going on, maybe months, maybe a year. Each moment we spent together had been tainted by her duplicity. I demanded answers, my voice cracking as I fired off questions. "How long has this been happening? Were you ever going to come clean? Did you ever once feel guilty?" She sank onto the couch, head in her hands, sobbing that she was confused, that she felt our relationship had grown stagnant and that she needed something new. She said she never intended to hurt me, that she convinced herself it was just a fling. I glared at her, anger boiling in my chest. "So you decided to cheat instead of talking to me? You told me you loved me, Olivia. Was that all a lie?" She shook her head violently, insisting she did love me in her own way, that she just got lost in the excitement and attention from someone else. The man, still hovering nearby, looked uneasy, maybe even remorseful. I turned to him, voice dripping with resentment. "Do you realize you've been involved with someone who was supposed to be my partner? Did she even tell you about me?" He nodded shamefacedly, saying something about how she said our relationship was on the rocks. I snorted, incredulous. Every word out of both their mouths felt like salt rubbed into my wounds. The room spun with tension, a suffocating swirl of betrayal and raw emotion. Unable to stand their presence, I told them both I was done, that I refused to be part of her twisted double life any longer. Olivia tried to block my path, begging me to talk, but I pushed past her, ignoring her sobs. As I walked out the door, I felt tears sting my own eyes, though I refused to let them fall in front of her. The drizzle outside seemed to mirror my inner turmoil. I glanced back at the townhouse, a dull ache in my chest, knowing that everything I believed about my life with Olivia was forever shattered. The drive home was a blur of pain. I replayed the confrontation, each detail burrowing deeper under my skin. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. The sense of heartbreak collided with a dark satisfaction that she could no longer pretend I knew nothing. I had caught her in the act, stripped away the lies. Yet that small victory did nothing to quell the anguish. Back at my place, once our place, I walked through the door and found myself in a space haunted by memories. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of her: a coffee mug she had painted, her slippers by the sofa, a half-finished art project in the corner. My resolve wavered. Part of me wanted to burn it all, to purge her memory from every inch of my world. Another part yearned for an explanation, for some magical fix that would turn back time, but I knew that was impossible. I spent the next few hours pacing, occasionally punching a wall, letting out muffled shouts of rage. My phone buzzed repeatedly, texts and calls from Olivia, presumably. I refused to answer any of them. I read one text that simply said, "Please, come back, I need to explain," and immediately felt a surge of disgust. She had plenty of time to explain before I found her in another man's home. She clearly never thought I would catch on, never believed I would track her movements and show up at the worst possible moment. I tossed the phone onto the couch and tried to gather my thoughts. As the hours ticked by, I realized I needed a plan. We were both on the lease here, though most of the bills were in my name. Did I even want to stay in this house, tainted as it was by her betrayal? I contemplated throwing her belongings out on the curb, but that seemed too dramatic. Instead, I sent her a single text that read, "Pack your things and find somewhere else to stay. I don't want you here tonight." Then I turned off my phone, ignoring any potential response. My eyes burned with unshed tears, and I was overwhelmed with exhaustion and heartbreak, so I eventually collapsed into the bed, still fully clothed, drifting into a restless sleep. Morning brought no solace. I woke with a hollow pit in my chest, a raw ache that refused to subside. I turned my phone back on to see a barrage of messages. She had left multiple voicemails, all full of apologies and pleas to let her explain. At some point, she even had the nerve to say it was just a phase she was going through, that it was meaningless compared to our relationship. Fury surged through me. If it was so meaningless, why had she built an entire web of lies around it? Why had she made time for him in the middle of her day, visited him regularly, let him fill a space in her life that should have been mine? My mind spun with questions, none of which had any satisfying answers. Midday, I texted her to coordinate a time for her to pick up her essential items. She replied that she would come by in the late afternoon. I prepared myself by collecting her things in boxes, clothes, toiletries, random personal items. I piled them in the living room, feeling numb. As the clock neared 4, I heard a car pull up outside. My heart hammered as she walked through the door, eyes red from crying. She looked pale, her hair disheveled. Normally, I would have felt concern, but I was too raw to care about her state. She opened her mouth, but I held up my hand to stop her from speaking. "I don't want to hear any more lies," I said, voice steady despite the storm inside me. She approached carefully, tears welling up again, insisting she wanted me to understand that she never stopped caring about me. I shook my head, gesturing to the boxes. "You made your choices, Olivia. The time for explanations was before you lied to my face for months." She sobbed, telling me she just got caught up in the thrill, that she thought I would never suspect, that it would eventually blow over. I snorted. "You thought I'd never find out, so that made it acceptable? You thought you could have your little fling and then come back as if nothing happened?" She averted her gaze, unable to refute that damning truth. We argued briefly, her tears fueling an anger in me that bordered on rage. She claimed she still wanted to salvage us, that we had built a life together. But the words felt hollow. I asked her how many times she visited him, if she'd had unprotected encounters, if she even once considered what it would do to me if I found out. Each question struck a nerve, and she flinched, tearfully admitting she hadn't thought it through. My chest tightened with heartbreak, realizing again how thoroughly she had disregarded my feelings. She began packing the boxes into her car, pausing between loads to beg for my forgiveness. I stood there, arms crossed, jaw clenched, unwilling to budge. I told her maybe, in time, I might be able to speak to her without resentment, but not now. The emotional wound was too raw, the betrayal too fresh. She left reluctantly, glancing back at me with one final appeal in her eyes. I offered no response, just closed the door and locked it, as if sealing out a painful chapter of my life. The moment she drove off, I felt tears spill over, hot and uncontrollable. I sank onto the floor, overwhelmed by the heartbreak, letting out ragged sobs that shook my entire body. The house echoed with silence afterward, an emptiness that felt crushing. In the days that followed, I navigated a haze of anger and grief. I told my closest friends what happened, receiving a flurry of sympathy and shock. Some offered their couches if I needed to get away, others assured me she would regret her choices eventually. My boss noticed my lack of focus at work, but I managed to keep it together, burying myself in tasks as a temporary distraction. Every night, though, I returned to the same lonely house, confronted by the memories and the knowledge that I had caught her red-handed. One evening, she attempted another apology call, leaving a voicemail that detailed her regret, claiming she ended things with the other man. She said she was willing to do anything to fix us, including therapy. The vulnerability in her voice tugged at me for a brief moment, reminding me of the love we once shared. But I couldn't shake the image of her in that townhouse, wrapped in someone else's arms, the carefully crafted web of lies she had spun. I deleted the voicemail without replying. Over time, I began removing traces of her from my life. I took down photos of us from the walls, put them in a box along with sentimental gifts she had given me. I rearranged furniture, trying to purge the sense of her presence in every corner. It was painful, but also strangely cathartic. I realized how much of myself I had given to her, how much trust one had invested in our future together. The betrayal taught me a harsh lesson about boundaries and vigilance. Part of me worried that I would never be able to trust another partner again. About a month later, I decided to move out of the bungalow altogether. Too many memories clung to the rooms, and the thought of living there alone was suffocating. I found a small loft closer to downtown, a change of scenery that offered a fresh start. As I packed my belongings, I stumbled upon old mementos, movie tickets from our first date, a pressed flower she gave me once. Each relic carried a bittersweet pang, a reminder of the happiness that had been overshadowed by deceit. In the process of moving, I discovered an old journal she had kept. Curiosity burned in me, but I hesitated to invade her privacy. In the end, I left it in one of her boxes, deciding I had seen enough of her hidden secrets to last a lifetime. I wanted to rebuild, to move forward without wallowing in the pain any longer. Let her keep her reasons, let her wrestle with her guilt or rationalizations. I was done playing detective in my own relationship. Word reached me through mutual acquaintances that the man she was involved with eventually broke things off. Apparently, he had his own issues, and the spark they had fizzled once the secrecy was gone. The news gave me no satisfaction. My heartbreak was still there, an ache that surfaced in unguarded moments. But I took solace in knowing I had confronted the truth instead of living in oblivion. Sometimes, the hardest thing in the world is to walk away, even when you know staying would only cause more damage. Months passed, and I found a new normal in my little loft. The pain dulled, though it never disappeared entirely. I met new people, tried new hobbies, found ways to piece myself back together. Occasionally, I would get a social media notification that Olivia had tried to connect or send a message. I ignored them. She had changed her profile picture to something upbeat, as if desperately trying to project a stable life. I knew better. Betrayal leaves scars on both sides, and I had no interest in exploring her scars or showing her mine. My only priority was to heal. During this journey, I learned about my own resilience. Catching her red-handed was devastating, but it set me free from a relationship built on lies. At times, I felt guilt for using the GPS tracker, for not simply having an open conversation. But then I remembered how many times I asked her if something was wrong, how many times she lied, how she thought I was oblivious. People sometimes say ignorance is bliss, but living with a gnawing suspicion is a special kind of torment. I chose knowledge, painful as it was, and that gave me the power to take control of my life again. Occasionally, I reflect on our time together, trying to pinpoint the exact moment she drifted away. Maybe it was gradual, the quiet accumulation of boredom or dissatisfaction that she never voiced. Maybe it was an impulsive decision that spiraled beyond her control. None of that changes the fact that she stepped beyond the bounds of trust, letting me believe we still had something real while she explored an entirely different romance on the side. I cannot excuse that, no matter the reasons behind it. The last I heard, she was moving to another city, likely in search of a fresh start. A mutual friend told me she reached out, wanting to see if there was any chance I'd be willing to talk. By then, I had made my stance clear. I had no desire to reconnect or reopen old wounds. The friend respected my decision and did not push. Perhaps someday, far in the future, we could speak without anger or sorrow. For now, the best thing for both of us was distance. Life continued. My new place grew cozier, and I found solace in quiet evenings, reading on the balcony or strolling downtown. I joined a local gym, reconnected with friends I had neglected, and gradually felt my emotional wounds scab over. The memory of her deception still lingered, but it no longer controlled me. In a strange way, the experience shaped my understanding of relationships, highlighting how crucial communication and honesty are. No love can survive if one partner decides the other does not deserve the truth. Looking back, the final confrontation at that townhouse still stands out as the moment everything changed. That instant I saw her arms around another man was like a jolt to the system, forcing me to confront the reality head-on. And in the aftermath, I discovered depths of resilience within myself that I never knew existed. She thought I would never find out, that her duplicity would stay hidden forever, but secrets have a way of unraveling, especially when your partner is determined to seek the truth. She played with my trust, underestimating how deeply I cared about our life together and how fiercely I would fight for answers. In the end, the only victory I claimed was the freedom to walk away from her lies, giving myself a chance to heal. I never wanted it to end like that, but life rarely cares about our preferences. Betrayal, once revealed, leaves little room for compromise. Now, as I stand on the threshold of new possibilities, I take a measured breath and step forward. My heartbreak is real, but so is my capacity to rise above it. Sometimes, catching someone red-handed is the only way to break the illusions that keep us trapped. Even though it hurt like hell, that exposure was the catalyst I needed to reclaim my life. And so, I keep going, determined to grow beyond the pain she caused, knowing that my next chapter will be written with honesty and courage, qualities I refuse to abandon just because someone else once did.